Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in another Tuesday discussion of Ayn Rand's essays. Today's essay is it's very salient for today's time, The Roots of War. So, James, could you explain us what this essay is about?
An essay first published in 1966 in Ayn Rand's, quite a while ago now, Ayn Rand's magazine, The Objectivist, and reprinted in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal as the second essay, right after her discussion of capitalism itself in her book on capitalism. That's how important an essay it is for Ayn Rand. The essay is called The Roots of War because what she's trying to do is get at the fundamental causes of international conflict. And to understand the causes of international conflict, she has to go back to in effect, the essential relationship between peace and freedom. Peace and freedom are really two aspects of the same more basic idea, the absence of coercive force between human beings. When the initiation of force is banned between human beings, we have a system which respects rights, we have a system of freedom, and of course, we have a system of peace internationally. Peace and freedom are in effect two sides of the same coin, two aspects of the same concept. And looking at it in the other way, statism is the basic cause of war, according to Ayn Rand. That is to say, the idea that force is okay, that violence and physical coercion are either morally permissible or an inevitable part of society. And if you believe that the initiation of force is okay, then of course you have the premise that will lead to war. No one who believes in individual rights, for example, in their own country, who doesn't believe it about their own country, could believe it about foreigners. If you don't respect individual rights at home, you cannot respect individual rights abroad. And so if you're not concerned about individual rights in your own country, you're going to be utterly indifferent to the rights of other people. And it is only this doctrine that can morally support all these rationalizations and all these bizarre moral justifications for war, because of course wars always have some kind of irrational moral justification, but they all must be predicated on the idea that it's okay to use force. And that is exactly what statism and war have in common. They are both the belief that coercive force among human beings is morally permissible or inevitable. So for Ayn Rand, the cause of war is dictatorship in the modern world. The cause of war is comparative statism. It is free countries that have an interest in peace. They want peace at home and they want peace abroad. It is statism and dictatorship that are the cause, the fundamental cause of most wars. That's her theme.
And I wanted to bring the Russia card later, but I think it's interesting that Putin was this kind of person who literally killed people abroad and who denies many people's rights inside his home rights, and many of the political dissidents. So it's interesting to analyze this in that
Absolutely.
context.
The man is a well-known murderer and thug. He suppresses the rights of his people. Demonstrations are illegal in Russia. You can't demonstrate, even in a peaceful way, without risking being arrested. That's what makes a lot of these internal Russian protests against the war that's going on right now so interesting. These people are brave to be in Red Square or in Petersburg demonstrating against war. These scientists signing letters against war are being very brave because their rights could be violated. But you're right. It's a great example because only a thug like Putin, who thinks it's okay to kill people, force people, be violent with people, his own people, could ever think that it would be okay to do mass murder on the scale that he's doing right now, to go kill innocent children like he's doing right now. No, it is the belief in the use of force that dictators have, that statists in general have, that of course permits them, morally permits them, psychologically permits them to engage in war abroad. It's the same idea. You know, Ayn Rand observes that of course it is only freedom that can underlie a prosperous economy. It is a dictatorship. This is the key to Ayn Rand's essay here. Dictatorship is already a state of war by a government against its own people. Dictatorship is a perpetual civil war. I mean, when you look at Nazi Germany, for example, and you look at the millions and 11 million people were slaughtered in concentration camps, millions more were in concentration camps. That is a kind of war against his own population. Jews, liberals, communists were all rounded up. Homosexuals, atheists were rounded up by Hitler and put into concentration camps. Nazism was before it became a war against Poland and France and Great Britain. Nazism was a war against Germans by Germans. The same is true of the Soviet Union. Look at the gulags of the Soviet Union. They are, in effect, the exact equivalent. It is, in effect, the Soviet Union was a perpetual civil war against its own people. And that's why when you see the Yeltsin revolt in the early 1990s, it was overwhelmingly popular. People wanted to get rid of it. But it is dictatorship that you see. It's its own war against its own people that must spill out. Because when they run out of domestic victims, as Ayn Rand observes, they will go for foreign victims. They will have to loot. When they're looting, can no longer squeeze any more juice out of the lemon that they've got at home. They've got to go squeeze foreign lemons and all the juice out of those. And that is, in effect, what wars are caused by. And it is always the comparatively statist countries, or almost always, this is a huge tendency at least, for the comparatively statist countries to be the initiators of war. Notice, as Ayn Rand observes, it was comparatively statist, the German Empire and the Russian Empire that basically dragged England and France into World War I. Yes, England had an unstated agreement with France, and France had an entente with Russia, but Russia's involvement in World War I, Germany's initiation of World War I, are what caused World War I. Look at in the United States, our involvement was very late in coming to World War I. Those who opposed our involvement in World War I were the Republicans. It's often the communists are thought of, well, they opposed World War I. Yeah, well, it's the Senate, Republicans in the Senate who are Woodrow Wilson's, and Woodrow Wilson was the great progressive president. He brought progressivism to America. He gave us income tax. He gave us the first really advanced push for socialistic type policies, which was known as progressivism at the time. He was the leftist progressive who wanted to make the world safe for democracy. In my view, Germany and Britain, in this great stalemate of a war, would almost surely have come to terms if America had not entered the war. And it was America's entering the war that crushed the Kaiser, destroyed the Habsburg and Hohenzollern empires, and left Germany open to a battle between communists and Nazis, just to see which of those would win out. And what did that lead to? That, of course, led to World War II. And how did that get started? Well, once more, Germany and Russia decide to invade Poland. And once that happened, world war in Europe, a huge war in Europe, was thereafter almost inevitable. Again, it is the comparatively statist countries which initiate wars against those who are comparatively free, because free countries don't have an interest in war. If you are a capitalist country, if you exist on production and trade, you have an interest against looting. Your interest is for a system that protects rights, property rights. If you are engaged in trade, what you need is long-term peace. You need trade lines to remain open. And once nations start interacting with trade, I mean, what keeps America from having another war with Japan or Germany today, which 70 years ago were its great enemies? We are now huge trading partners. We're interdependent economically on one another. The idea of Japan or Germany going to war with the United States is utterly inconceivable now, 70 years on, precisely because of the peaceful trading agreements that we have. Capitalism and capitalists have nothing, but true capitalists have nothing but an interest in peace.
Do you think that is why there are way much less wars today, even though we live in a more statist world than in the past?
I do believe that we have a lot more international trade, and sort of since the Well, you could term certain periods in history sort of the Pax Romana, when the Roman Empire brought peace to the entire Mediterranean area, which opened up trade and prosperity and created an era of free trade and prosperity throughout the Mediterranean, or the Pax Britannia in the 19th century, with British trade opening up trade all over the world. Again, that was conducive to peace more than anything else. Or say what some people have called the Pax Americana after World War II. America sort of, there was a huge Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, one which, by the way, the Soviet Union could not sustain in peace. You'll notice that after about 30, 40 years of peace after World War II, the Soviet Union as a dictatorship couldn't really survive economically. And it was becoming clear what a basket case they were. They initiate the war in Afghanistan in the late 70s, which is a total disaster, and one of the final pushes over the cliff for them. But once more, peace was the enemy, in effect, and world trade was the enemy both of the Soviet Empire and a propagator of peace in our time. I think another factor is the existence of nuclear weapons. Ayn Rand points out repeatedly in this essay that nuclear weapons really have made war too horrible to contemplate. They really have. Not just the development of the atomic bomb, but the development of even worse atomic weapons like the hydrogen bomb, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could destroy civilization. And so I think people, especially great powers, until Russia now, but especially the great powers, were reluctant to do things that would go to war because everyone knew it could be suicide on their part as well. So between the pressures of having nuclear weapons out there and the expansion of trade under what I would call the Pax Americana, there is a lot more trade. And the more international trade there is, the less likely international war will be.
No. One of the crucial concepts that she uses in the essay is something that she had already brought in her essay, What is Capitalism?, which is the first one in the book. And that is the tribal premise. And she thinks that that also explains a good chunk of the justification of words. Could you remind us what the tribal premise is?
Well, I would relate that also to another essay that we've discussed, Faith and Force, Destroyers of the Modern World. And in those two previous essays that we've discussed here, Ayn Rand discusses the relationship between reason and freedom and faith and force. But in this context, it boils down to a really simple idea. When physical force, when the initiation of coercive force is permitted, whether officially by law or is simply permitted, then would it become in an anarchistic context? Then obviously you as an individual have no power. Only in a world that respects rights is your freedom and your individual power to control your life meaningful. Absent that, there is no other means of protecting yourself from the force that's going on other than the size and power of your gang. Now, there's always a difference as to how we decide what gang we belong to. Is it a matter of race? Is it a matter of religion? Is it a matter of your nation state? Is it a matter of your social class, your economic class, according to the Marxists? So how we define the group that you join is a matter of ideology and how crude your ideology is. But once the guns start coming out, once force is being initiated, then the question is, what is my gang strong enough to survive? Is my gang strong enough to protect my interests? It's my gang versus your gang. Once you get rid of reason, of course, it's all bets are off, and the gang is determined relatively mystically. And the crudest form is, of course, racism. My race versus your race, sort of a physical or a genetic, crude way of looking at it, or as opposed to the sort of fancy Marxist way of looking at class conflict. But really, it's my group versus your group, and that's the tribal premise. And that is the inevitable outcome of force being used in society. People will gather into groups to protect themselves from force in the only way they can, that having their individual minds and their individual freedom having been rendered irrelevant.
Another issue that I found very interesting is that she provides her own analysis is able to contemplate issues such as the degrees of statism affecting the winners and profiteers in war. Could you comment on that?
Oh man, oh man. I was just having these thoughts again about Ukraine and Russia, right? The Ukraine is not a perfect Jeffersonian democracy by any means, and it never has been. But it is the victim of aggression. An objectivist historian, a contributor to Capitalism and an Ideal, once said to me a very important thing. He said, the most important words in history and politics, the three most important words in history and politics are compared to what? And so what we have here with Ukraine and Russia is exactly this, the example brought to the fore, right? Compared to what? Ukraine is certainly more free than Russia, which is a total full-on dictatorship as far as I'm concerned. And of course, Russia has been making all these nationalistic clamors to restore, it's no longer crude communism, but it's more crude nationalism on the part of Russia now. This crude nationalism, because what? Because he's having domestic political problems. The domestic political problems that are inevitable to a dictator. He needs to save face on the international stage. He'd like the resources, the breadbasket and the mineral resources of Ukraine. Of course he would. He would also like that security. He doesn't want the insecurity of having a nation that could join the EU or NATO right there on his underbelly. And so all these issues, the irrational fear that a dictator will naturally have, the weaknesses that a dictator will naturally have, will cause this, even though it's not a perfectly rights-respecting place. And in the course of history, that's what we have to understand, is that we haven't experienced perfect capitalism. We haven't. But we have experienced comparative capitalism. And the comparatively free countries are the ones who wish peace. The comparatively statist countries are the ones, for all these inevitable reasons, the weakness of statism itself, they're buying into the premise of force itself, that naturally and inevitably make them the aggressors in most wars in human history. I think you were also adding a new part here. And the new part here is this confusion. We're often told that it is the desire for material resources or the desire for profits that motivate war. Not all wars are motivated by such things. Sometimes wars are motivated by national honor, national glory, national pride, something like that, religious reasons like the Crusades and stuff that aren't directly economic reasons at all. So there's non-economic war. But very often people will say, oh, well, it's greed for resources. Well, capitalism is not the quest for material resources. Capitalism is not the quest for material advantage. It is the distinction between production and trade, which operates by means of freedom, and looting, which is the diametrical opposite of freedom and the respect for rights. And so, just as in Atlas Shrugged, Dagny Taggart is very different from James Taggart, and Hank Rearden is very different from Orrin Boyle, so it is that simply because someone wants material resources and are going for it doesn't make them a capitalist. Many dictators seek material resources. That doesn't make them capitalists any more than it makes Orrin Boyle or James Taggart capitalists. They're seeking government favors in a domestic way. The international thug is just doing the looting internationally. The looting and producing are opposites. The values of a producer must be diametrically opposite from all of those interests of a looter. A man who produces wants property rights respected. He wants peace. He wants long-term peace so he can engage in long-term trade. He cannot afford force. He cannot abide rights violations. Protecting his rights are essential to production and trade. Looting is, of course, the very opposite. It is the destruction of property rights. It is outright theft or outright slavery. And what is amazing is that people confuse the two. And is the left, obviously, and our communist friends, who are the ones who are pulling this nonsense over on the world. As if any material desire, selfishness, you see, again, altruism is the culprit behind this confusion as well. Any attempt at material resources is equated with capitalism. And so outright dictatorship, seizing people and seizing property is thought of as some kind of form of capitalism, when it is, of course, the very opposite.
I wanted to bring your knowledge as a historian, because I think sometimes it is very important for the dictator in power to win wars, to look powerful, and to sustain his regime because of the looting, but also because he represents some sort of national prestige or something. Do you think that is why some dictators such as Idi Amin or similar keep their military customs even in peace times?
Oh yeah. Oh, the general, your typical fascist-leaning generalissimo, whether in Africa or in Latin America, is exactly that. Exactly that. They'll continue to wear their uniforms. They understand where their power comes from. It doesn't come from the moral belief in individual rights. It doesn't come from a peaceful desire to listen to their people. No, they understand where their power comes from: the military, the gun, the club, nakedly so.
Now, there is another thing related to something that you said a couple of minutes ago, which was the issue of U.S. intellectuals bringing the U.S. to World War I, then World War II. I was wondering if you happen to know a bit more about the UK, not only in the role of wars, but in the role of the 17th and 19th centuries.
Ayn
You
Rand
happen
is
to know if it was less even, less, there were people that abstained from the interventions, that were less worried there.
Ayn Rand brilliantly. She was writing primarily to an American audience during the Vietnam War and the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which basically conditioned the context of her article. But I can broaden it out, her analysis of American history. She observes that, as I had previously observed, that it was the progressives, the left-leaning politicians, first Teddy Roosevelt, the first guy who really gave us the idea of an American empire. He went to war with the Spanish Empire, took Cuba and the Philippines and Guam, a good chunk of the Spanish Empire from Spain, and he sent the American Navy around the world as a show of force. Well, he was a progressive too. He was a progressive too. The next great progressive was Woodrow Wilson. And he was off in an altruistic fashion to make the world safe for democracy. So he was going to join and drag America into World War I. And again, World War II and led the intellectuals there. It was the New Republic magazine. It was Mr. Crowley of the New Republic who thought, what was his comment? America needs the tonic of a moral adventure? America needs the tonic of a moral adventure of a war? In any event, again, fast forward, FDR and the Democrats at the time were the ones who were accusing Republicans of being isolationists, American firsters, reluctant to go to war. Just like the Republicans in the Senate were the ones who were reluctant to go to World War I, so it was conservatives who were reluctant to get into World War II. Ayn Rand herself opposed Korea, Vietnam during her own lifetime. Again, wars both started by leftist presidents, not so-called capitalist presidents. Now, let's talk about England. The equivalent history occurred in England only a little earlier. Gladstone versus Disraeli. Gladstone is the one who was the comparative liberal. He wanted free trade. He wanted to liberalize election laws in Great Britain. He wanted a more humane policy towards Ireland. He ended up being in favor of Irish Home Rule. He was also the one who didn't want British Empire. He was also the one who said we shouldn't use force to maintain our empire. He was the guy in favor of peace. He was the guy who wanted peace, and he was the guy who was the liberal. Liberal both in his policy towards people, human beings, and liberal in his economic policy. They go together. Capitalism and liberalism went right together. Forget the compromises and haverings of Gladstone, because there were a lot of that. He did compromise, and he was too moderate about some of that. If only he'd been more consistent in his liberalism. But it is Gladstone in the Victorian era who opposed the British imperialism. It was his rival, Disraeli, who, of course, advocated the great social reform policies, both domestically in Great Britain and turned Queen Victoria into the Empress of India, and who wanted intervention and the use of force to maintain the British Empire. So here you have a classic example, and the United States and Great Britain were the closest things that the world had ever really come to in capitalism. So they are really the examples we have here of how capitalism is what encourages and supports peace, and you can see it even politically. Now you ask about intellectuals. Just as there was an intellectual dispute between Republicans and Democrats in my country in the 20th century, so there was a similar intellectual dispute between those who were friends of Gladstone's policy and those who were more friendly with Benjamin Disraeli's policy. You know, until Disraeli, the standard liberal attitude was that the empire was sort of a millstone around the British neck. Oh, this is costing us way too much. Is it really worth it? Can't we have trade with India and China without having an empire? Right? Gladstone opposed the Opium Wars. Gladstone, the liberal. So these Opium Wars, the use of commerce, the use of trade to oppress China, that was opposed by the British liberals. And of course, it was the intellectuals who supported Gladstone. People like Lord Acton, the great liberal historian Lord Acton. And of course, lots of people in the British media who were calling the British Empire a burden on Britain, not an advantage to Britain, that we could have peaceful trade with India and China without the need to go to war over opium or to enforce the Raj in India. It's a classic, both in Britain and in the United States. There was an intellectual basis for this dispute and a political manifestation of it. And it was the capitalists who were the pro-peace party between, say, the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th.
What about Leopold II in Congo with Belgium? Do you think it's the classic case?
Counterexample, because, you know, a lot of people will point out, well, this is a great counterexample to you, Miss Rand. Here you've got a civilized European country, Belgium, that is engaged in horrific atrocities in the late 1800s. I don't know if the audience is well aware of this, but in the late 1800s, Belgium was assigned what is today's Zaire, Congo, right, by the other European powers. Europe had in effect already taken complete control over Africa. African countries were no longer calling the shots and really could not. They were so overwhelmed by European technology. But in the case of the Congo, what happened is that when it was assigned by the other European powers, mind you, Central Africa was simply signed over. Germany, France, and Britain said, Belgium, you take the Congo. And what happened? The government of Belgium didn't really take control of the Congo. Congo was the personal property of King Leopold. And King Leopold could treat it like his personal, and it's the king. It's not some capitalist. It's the king who's doing this. And what else? He's sending Belgian gendarmes down to create the Force Publique, which was notorious. They would cut off your arms. African natives were abused, beaten, raped, dismembered if they didn't meet the rubber quotas. But you see, we have a material resource that the King of Belgium is profiting from. Isn't that capitalism? No, it is not capitalism. It is one of these special favors that Orrin Boyle and James Taggart get domestically. He got internationally. He got a special favor to give him exclusive control. And what did he do? He acted like a thug and a dictator with force publique, governmental force. He acted like a dictator in the Congo. And that's what explains those atrocities. It was the comparative dictatorial power of Belgium, and in particular, I think Belgium has less blame collectively than King Leopold. Now, King Leopold denied knowledge. He did his own commission as, I was shocked to find out that these poor natives were getting their limbs chopped off. But it was King Leopold who did it. And King Leopold's fascist little thugs that he sent down there with the force publique that did this. It was government. It was not capitalism. And to confuse the mere quest, what they would call the greed for material resources, the rubber resources in the Congo that led to all this. Well, again, it's the confusion between capitalism and a thug's quest to loot material resources. You can say both are a quest for material resources. You say both are a quest for profit, right? But it's all the difference between a thief and a producer. King Leopold was a thief who was using his vast rubber resources in Congo and those people like slaves to do this. Now, is it an example of a comparatively statist country versus a comparatively non-statist country? Well, as I say, that it really wasn't a war so much as it was a domestic slaughter by an existing dictator, King Leopold. Has nothing to do with capitalism, though. It was quite the opposite. And it's not as though Ayn Rand is saying here that every instance of international violence can be understood in these simple terms. You've got Belgium, a relatively civilized country, one of the leaders in the European industrial revolution, maybe the second country after Britain to get really industrialized. Belgium, their rights were being respected by the Belgian government. King Leopold couldn't get away with what he was getting away with in the Congo in Belgium, precisely because Belgium had a better understanding of individual rights. You'd never get away with that, King Leopold. Here in Brussels, you can get away with that. In the Congo, you can't get away with that here. That's the real difference that I would focus on here. But even there, the abuse of the Congo by Belgium in the late 1800s had nothing to do with capitalism. It was an Oren Boyle looter, in effect, who's sending down fascist thugs to abuse the natives to get rubber.
Wasn't Belgium at the time a more or less free country inside Belgium?
Yeah. Oh, I would have to have classified Belgium in the late 19th century as one of the freest countries on earth. That's why I'm saying that that it may not fit exactly the idea of a freer country, but look, Belgium, he couldn't get, like I say, Leopold couldn't get away with what he did in the Congo in Belgium, could he? That would have been utterly intolerable. That would have been utterly intolerable. Leopold, a king, doesn't have to treat Congo like he has to treat the Belgians, his own people. That's the key here. And he was free to act like a thug, like one of these looters, an Oren Boyle, a James Taggart, on an international scale, if you will. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, returning to the essay, could you comment on what did Rand think about those people who opposed wars but didn't oppose statism?
What a bizarre contradiction. In other words, what they're saying is that this was very true when she wrote in 1966, by the way. The real radicals for peace were saying we should have peace with the Soviet Union. Even as the Soviet Union is, marching tanks into Hungary in the 50s and Czechoslovakia, as we were discussing the other day, in the 60s. So here you've got a place that's got gulags, and you got Alexander Solzhenitsyn complaining about it, and the peaceniks here at home were saying peace with Russia, peace with Russia. Okay, so you advocate international peace, but you're perfectly cool with dictatorship abroad. So in other words, if the victims are unarmed, that's okay. If the victims are helpless, the domestic, innocent civilian population of the dictator, the dictator can use whatever violence and force he wants against them. But should he decide to take that violence across the border, how horrible, horrible, horrible. Wait a minute, what a bizarre contradiction at its root. The very thing that leads to war, dictatorship, this war of this government against its own people, which will spill out inevitably over to other countries. The very cause of war, they're utterly blinded to. They're utterly blinded to because they don't have a consistent position on coercion. They believe it's perfectly okay for a government to force around its own people, but on the other hand, some kind of international dispute is what? Inherently wrong? It's not morally consistent. It's not historically realistic, and it's worse than a contradiction. It blurs what I started with here, the conceptual relationship between freedom and peace.
Now, let me thank you, the super chatters, which we have plenty of them today. Gail says, "Thank you, gentlemen. The more capitalist nations are too busy producing wealth, not war. Trade begets benevolence."
It sure does. It sure does. Every capitalist, I go to a store, I go to my local store, and I buy something and I hand him the money, and I'll say thank you and he'll say thank you because we've both gained. We both perceive that this purely voluntary transaction has left us both better off. Has left us both better off. Capitalism is the only system in which conflicts of interest are not necessary, in which humans can and must operate by peace with one another. They've got to put the guns and the clubs aside in order to engage in trade. Trade is the essence of life, of production. Trade is what it's doing is creating the values of life, the very opposite of looting, the very opposite of murder. Capitalists cannot afford war. They oppose it every time. Now, are there, let's use an example that is often used by the left, defense contractors, munitions builders, who are said to profiteer off war, getting back to one of your earlier questions there. Again, just because there's a businessman out there selling a product does not make him a capitalist. If he's depending on government favors, government contracts, government regulations, which exactly is what munitions builders and defense contractors are all depending on. They are the handmaidens of the state. They're not handmaid. They want war. The only people that are going to profit, say, between the West selling or giving weapons away to the Ukrainians right now are these big companies in my country, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, these big defense contractors. Oh boy, I can see the cha-ching going on in their head. Everyone else is going to suffer from higher gas prices, disruptions in trade. Just because this narrow little segment of the economy, defense contractors are going to profit, it's going to come at the expense of all other trade. All other trade. So again, it's not capitalism that leads to war, but the opposite. It's government's need for these weapons that creates these profiteers from munitions and stuff.
Then we have two super chats from Marvin. He says, should economic sanctions be left to the private sector? Does the context change with a real threat?
Well, let's go back to the situation with Russia before this recent invasion of Ukraine. Should we have been trading with them at all? Should we have had diplomatic relations with Russia? Should Europe have been buying its oil from a dictator like that? No. America was offering all this much cleaner liquefied natural gas, but no, Germany wants these pipelines for Soviet petroleum to come in, so forth, just so they could be more dependent on a dictatorship. It's, you say, well, now that they're invading, let's do sanctions. Well, I say that if there was no diplomatic relationship, if there was no normalized trading relationship with Russia before this war, we wouldn't have allowed Russia to get into this position where they could do this. Of course, to prepare for this war, he had to expect economic sanctions. Economic sanctions. So I ask you, what is more effective? Putting on little economic sanctions here and there by the law? No? Or how about just not having diplomatic relations with Russia because they're a dictatorship? Or not having diplomatic relations with China because they're a dictatorship? The Taiwan-China situation is even more poignant. Should Russia succeed and get away with this invasion of Ukraine, what is that but a green light to another dictatorship, China, to invade Taiwan? And Taiwan is truly a comparatively free place. It's got a relatively free country going on there in Taiwan, and they could be invaded. But what makes that invasion all the more difficult for America? The fact that we've been engaged in trade with China so intensely for the last 20 or 30 years. The same economic interests that cause peace, interdependence, trade interdependence, now work against you because now you've recognized a thug, made it permissible and easy and safer for companies to engage in trade. I myself think trade should be left up to private companies and private individuals. But I don't think those private companies and private individuals would do much trade if their nation did not recognize and carry on friendly relations with these dictators in the first place. So we only need sanctions now because we've been feeding them and sanctioning them for decades, which of course we should never have done in the first place.
And a good chunk of the sanctions don't include oil.
I mean, absolutely insane. We shouldn't be buying it all. And now you oppose sanctions, but the sanctions exclude energy. The big ticket profit item for Russia, the very thing that Russia survives on, is these oil profits. Well, we're going to leave that out, even though it's actually a necessary war resource too. Petrol. Okay, what do you think is I think it's diesel that's fueling those tanks that are now marching into Ukraine. I mean, the truth is, I don't think Ukraine is a perfect uh, place with freedom and democracy. On the other hand, Zelensky is absolutely right. Every drop of Russian oil that the West buys has blood on it. Has blood on it. That is why the United States should never have been facilitating trade agreements with Russia and China, much less have diplomatic relations with dictators. No, it is our morally compromised policy with dictatorships that forces us into this position of now having to slap on tariffs after the fact, closing the barn door long after the cattle have all walked out.
Yeah, and the West shouldn't have punched himself in the face by banning fracking with this whole other issue.
Think of all the ways that Biden set this up. Oh my gosh. I mean, I wasn't in favor of remaining in Afghanistan, but the horrifically incompetent way in which he removed America from Afghanistan, betraying our allies, or betraying the Afghans who worked with us. It was horrific the way he left Afghanistan. He talks about limited incursions, as if that would be okay. We wouldn't have a moral objection to a limited incursion. Okay. And maybe worst of all, he increased the profitability of Russia as such when he cut back on domestic oil production. And it is mostly just fear of the Biden administration's environmental policies that keeps energy production low here at home. They cannot rely on an administration that wants to wipe out fossil fuels as such. If that's the official policy from the president, are you likely to go sign a oil lease from a government land? It shouldn't be government land in the first place, but are you likely to sign a lease on government land for oil if you think that the government is hostile to fossil fuels as such and wants to phase them out over the next 10, 15 years anyway? No, you won't. So just with his environmental policy, Biden comes in and America is now producing millions fewer barrels of oil every year. As a result, making the profitability of Russia higher, they're getting more money for their oil, and making Europe all the more dependent on Russian energy to survive. No, he made us vulnerable to this through his policy, and of course he opened up negotiations with Russia's ally, Iran again. All of that was just simply sending a green light. I'm weak, I'm weak, I'm weak, I'm weak. But notice this war started back in 2014. When Russia took over Crimea. Obama, he sent blankets and, didn't kind of like it, but this war has been going on for about 8 years now, actually. So I have to look back on all three of our last presidents, Biden, Trump, and Obama, as having dropped the ball and failed rather miserably in setting this all up.
Yeah, I mean, Europe also has the blame. I mean, banning fracking, having this whole issue with energy here, because fracking causes 2 Richter scale earthquakes, which is, I think, probably if a fat woman jumped.
Well, I live in Southern California. You're not going to impress me with a 0.2 on the Richter scale. Each one of those steps in the Richter scale is 10 times stronger than the next. So Richter scale 2 is 10 times stronger than 1. But 1, 2, 3, we get those in Southern California all the time. It barely causes us to notice. It's when it gets up to 5, 6, 7 that it causes big damage. But in any event, it is absolutely insane. I mean, America engaged in a whole bunch of fracking under Trump, and we really had a whole lot of success with it. We were also using a huge resource we have in North America, natural gas. We figured out how to liquefy it and export it by ship now. And it's much cleaner than burning coal or regular petrol. And so those, it seems to me, are much, you'd think, you'd think from their own perspective, much better options than to be dependent upon Russia. The thought, it's an interesting thing both with China and Russia. Some of the thinking that has built up to this was the idea that, well, if trade does help peace, then maybe if we have extensive trading relationships with Russia and China, this will reduce the chances for peace. Not when it's a dictatorship. Not when it's a dictatorship that doesn't respect rights, that doesn't believe in freedom or capitalism, that doesn't respect anybody's property rights. We cannot engage in trade with them. They'll end up doing what China does, stealing intellectual property. Right? They'll end up doing what Russia does, in effect. No, it is a policy of appeasement and trade with dictators that gets us set up for these situations. It only makes us more vulnerable if and when they do engage in aggressive war, which is exactly what's happening right now, and limits our options in dealing with it. And gives huge profits to the dictator, by the way, which are totally unnecessary and self-inflicted on the part of the West.
The second question of Marvin was how to prevent free countries to get less free during a defensive war. The US lost freedom with every external war.
Oh boy, yeah, that is exactly it. World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, after 9/11, the Patriot Act. Why is it that politicians will use a crisis every time to increase their dictatorial powers? They do it, and they do it every time. Warfare is the health of the state. Warfare is the health of statism. You see, just as capitalists, their interests are totally opposed to looting and war, they want peace and trade. They're engaged in production and trade. If you are a looter, your interest is in favor of looting and war. And it's really, really, really simple. You have that, you align your values like that. It is suicide to have a normal trading relationship with a dictatorship, because they always have a motive to go to war. They always have a motive to take unfair advantage. You're only setting yourself up with this dependency, as I say.
So I think I'm out of questions. James, you wanted to talk something more about this issue, which maybe I skipped.
No, I think you really had outstanding questions, by the way, as always, Alejandro. But the truth is that dictators are always using force. They have no moral compunction against doing it to their own citizens. Right? One point Ayn Rand makes in this essay: civil wars are typically far bloodier than international wars. And one reason for this is that a foreign government can't hurt my rights nearly so much as my own government can. And if I don't have a peaceful means of changing my government, right, through free speech and some kind of representative democracy, if I don't have a peaceful means of changing it, the government is forcing me into a position of war with them. The American Civil War, the Bolshevik Revolution. Civil wars are bloody business. The English Civil War in the 17th century, bloodiest businesses that a country usually engages in, because the power of your local government to violate your rights is far greater than that of any foreign government. But it is foreign dictatorship that, of course, spills out onto other countries. Dictatorship in the modern era is the cause of war, the fundamental cause of war. Ayn Rand's point here, and we're living through yet another example.
Thank you very much, James. And thank you, Jonathan, who sent us a super chat. Just thanks. Oh, and Teresa Dean, thank you very much again.
Thank you, Jonathan and Teresa.
Thank you very much again for a fantastic discussion, James. I think it's a great essay to talk about given today's circumstances.
Absolutely. This idea that somehow capitalism is war or leads to war, that is a simple confusion of a quest for material resources, which totally non-capitalistic looters can have. A thief can want material resources. A looter can want material resources. That does not transform him into a capitalist. It transforms him into the opposite. A capitalist is someone who respects rights because he needs his own property rights. A capitalist is someone who wants peace because he wants long-term trade, voluntary trade. The interests of looters and moochers and the interests of capitalists could not be more diametrically opposed. And what the left traditionally tells us, capitalism is the cause of war, is exactly the opposite of the truth. Capitalism is the cure for war. And if we want a world of peace, then we should be fighting dictatorship. We should be advocating rights-respecting nations. We should be pursuing international trade, capitalism.
Amen. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
And to the audience, please, if you like this kind of discussions, become a member. The memberships are very affordable, starting at £10 a month, and you get a lot of perks. Please become a member.
Definitely.
You're already, thank you.
Definitely. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit share, comment, and do consider becoming a paid subscriber. It does begin as low as £10 a month, but you can go up from there, and you get all kinds of benefits. And I know I always say this, but I'm going to say it one more time. Just the Don Watkins Communication Bootcamp by itself is certainly worth £10 a month for anyone interested in communicating ideas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.